So for this video, we're going to do kind of an introduction into Rhino, kind of what are the basics of Rhinoceros 5.0, and what do we need to know when we start this. So the good thing about Rhino 5.0 is that it works in a number of ways. In terms of geometry, it works in four different ways. You have curves, you have surfaces, you have solids, and you have meshes. Now this is quite important because this is a good program. It works in 2D and 3D. So it's kind of a mix of AutoCAD and a mix of SketchUp. It's quite effective in that sense. So when you open up Rhino 5.0, you see that this is kind of the screen that you get. And a couple of things to start off with is when you do any kind of command, there's three ways of kind of doing that command. The first is you have these options at the top. So if you ever want to do any of these commands, you can simply click on these pull downs and you start to have all of these options. For example, if you want to create a circle, you can go to curve, you can go to circle, and you can do maybe a 2-point circle. And you have multiple options. So for solids, if you want to create a sphere or a mesh, or if you want to transform an object like rotate. So all of these options can be found at the top. That's option one. Option two is you have a command box, just like AutoCAD. You can actually type in whatever command you wanna have. So for example, if you want to create a circle, you just type in circle, and it gives you a couple options. Do you want a 2-point circle? We just did 2 points. Let's click 2-point again, and it asks you for things like start of diameter, end of diameter. So we started it. Let's say we want it at 4 feet. It'll make it a 4 feet diameter circle. So that's option number two. This command box. Option number three is you have these tabs at the top, and each of these tabs have these quick shortcuts. So for example, in standard, you can see that there's a circle shortcut, and if you cascade over this arrow, it'll give you multiple options, and then you can find the one that we just did, circle diameter, which is a 2-point circle. And it's going to pretty much do the same thing that we did in the last two options as well. And you start to have multiple tabs, and you can see that a lot of these start to change, and this will start to change as well. Surface tools, you get more options. If you go to solid tools, you get more options. Rendering, drafting, so forth. And I recommend keeping it at standard, because standard really gives you that that quick shortcut option. And that's option number three. So you have option one with the pull downs, option two with the command box, and option three with these kind of tabs and shortcuts. So that's kind of how you create anything in Rhino. The second thing to consider is that you have these viewports. You have top view, front view, right view, and perspective view. And the main reason they really have this is so that you can kind of see objects in multiple views at one time. For example, you're not just modeling in perspective, but you're seeing it in elevational view at all times. If you want to enlarge, for any kind of view, just double click on that box itself. So double click on perspective, and you'll zoom in on that perspective view. And if you double click to, of course, go back, and you can do that with any kind of view. If you look at this pull down right here, it gives you different types of options about the viewport itself. For example, if you want a shaded view, it'll turn into a shaded view. If you want a x-ray view, it'll be an x-ray view. Or if you want a pen view, but I recommend keeping it on shaded or wireframe. Also more options, like if you want to change the view to maybe a 2-point perspective, you can start to have a 2-point perspective view. This becomes quite useful in terms of diagramming as well. And of course you can name those views, so you have all of these options. And if you want to edit any of it, of course, you can look into here. So those are those four things. You can also find those four views at the very bottom if you want to quickly toggle from view to view. So those are the viewports. To quickly summarize that, you have a grid and you have X, Y, and Z axis. Another important thing is if you ever worked with AutoCAD, you can start to recognize some of these things on the bottom. You start to have options like grid snap. You start to have options like ortho. Grid snap lets you snap to the grid. Ortho is for drawing orthogonal lines. So for example, it's going to be only straight lines. If you don't want straight lines, just turn off ortho and you can start to do freehand lines. So that's quite nice. You have things like planar if you want to keep it in one axis. O-snap is very, very important. So O-snap kind of shows you how you can quickly snap to any kind of object. So for example, if I draw a rectangle, now I can quickly snap to the endpoint, or I can snap on to the midpoint, and I can use it quite effectively for finding the intersection of objects. Now these lines that you see are pretty much guidelines. That's the smart track option. So it's going to give you these guides So you can start to kind of align things. If you turn this off, then you can see that none of those guides are showing up at all, right? Another important thing is of Gumball. Gumball is great because in Rhino you're working in 4 different viewports. So this lets you quickly move objects from X, Y, or Z, or you can rotate it in the X, Y, and Z direction. And this is, very helpful when you start to model buildings. That way you don't change things that you don't want to change. So that's kind of the other options. You have, of course, a history, stuff like that as well. It'll show you your coordinates on the x-axis. And that's the bottom portion. Another important portion is if you look in this right tab, you start to have options like properties. So you have properties on lens length. If you, look at it in terms of a camera, you have wallpaper options. One of the most important things from Rhino is the layers. So just like AutoCAD, you have a layers option, so you can start to create new layers. So let's create a new layer for, let's say, walls. And let's create a new layer for maybe columns. And you can create sub-layers as well. So if you right-click, you can create a sub-layer. So you can do maybe interior walls or an exterior walls, so forth, like that. And you can start to kind of change the color. So let's make columns maybe like a red color, just in terms of how we can kind of differentiate between columns and walls. And you can double click to get on that layer. You can start to create columns. And if you double click on walls, you can start to have a wall right next to it. That way, just so you can keep an eye on different types of geometry. And then you also have things like light bulbs. So if you want to turn off whatever layer you're on, that way you can hide things, you can lock things as well, so that this can be moved around, for example, but this can't be moved because it's locked. So layers are quite important, and when it comes to rendering, you have more options like materials. If you want to start to edit line weights, so if you're working in 2D, for example, if you have a 2D drawing, you can actually edit the line weights. You can edit, what type of printing width it's going to have, or what type of line type, hidden, dash, all of that. So that's kind of helpful as well. Display options, if you have different types of preferences. And all of these tabs can be moved around. They can be extended. They can kind of be moved back. And that's the good thing about Rhino. It's, it's very user-friendly. So after that, now that we've actually gone through all of these, what's on the screen, a couple things to consider is when you're setting up any kind of Rhino file or Rhino program, you want to make sure your properties are looking good. So one of the most important things is units. So if we want to change our units, we simply type in units. Now it's going to pull up this properties tab. Now I recommend using feet as your modeling. If you're doing furniture, you can do inches. You have tolerance levels if you want to have very detailed, but I doubt you need it. Also, distance display, I highly recommend using feet and inches, since we're working in architecture. That's going to be quite helpful. Let's press OK. And you also have more options, annotations, if you want to do hatches or dimensions. You have multiple things like appearance, like those views that we talked about. You have modeling aids if you do nudge, smart track. So all of these kind of properties in Rhino can be edited. So at a more advanced level, you can kind of edit what things you prefer, your preferences. And yeah, with that, that's pretty much it. That's kind of a quick introduction to Rhino, and kind of the commands and how it works.